about the Philippines, but no one took it seriously. Why? Imagine this, one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century, a leader who took a tiny fishing village and transformed it into one of the most prosperous nations in the world, looked at the Philippines and shook his head. He saw something coming, something dangerous. He spoke about it, warned about it, and yet no one seriously listened. That man was Lee Kuan Yew, the founding father of modern Singapore, and his warning about the Philippines, it was ignored. But what exactly did he say, and why? Decades later, do his words feel more relevant than ever? Sit tight, because we're about to dive deep into Lee Kuan Yew's final warning about the Philippines, his brutally honest words, the historical context, and how his predictions might be unfolding before our very eyes. To understand the weight of his warning, we need to understand the man behind the words. Lee Kuan Yew was not just a leader, he was a visionary, a strategist, and a man who transformed an island with no future into one of the most prosperous nations in the world. When Singapore gained independence in 1965, it was in a dire state. The country had no natural resources, no deep reservoirs of wealth, and no established military. Tensions threatened to tear the young nation apart, and unemployment was rampant. To many, Singapore seemed destined to fail. But under Lee Kuan Yew's leadership, Singapore defied the odds. He built a government that was efficient, disciplined, and incorruptible. He instilled a culture of hard work and meritocracy, ensuring that talent, no connections, determined success. He cracked down on corruption with an iron fist, implemented strict policies to maintain order, and prioritized education as the foundation of national progress. His leadership style was not without criticism. He was ruthless when necessary, using strict laws and heavy-handed measures to maintain stability. But there was no denying the results. Within a few decades, Singapore went from a struggling island nation to a global economic powerhouse, boasting one of the highest GDPs per capita in the world. Now compare that to the Philippines in the 1960s. At the time, the Philippines was seen as a rising star in Asia. Manila, often called the Pearl of the Orient, was a bustling city with modern infrastructure, a strong economy, and a thriving middle class. The country had some of the best universities in the world and was home to a well-educated workforce. Many believed that the Philippines was on track to become one of the most developed nations in Asia, far ahead of countries like Singapore, Taiwan, and South Korea. But something happened along the way. While other nations surged ahead, the Philippines stagnated. Decades of political instability, corruption, and poor governance took their toll. Infrastructure crumbled, industries declined, and economic progress slowed. Instead of investing in long-term growth, leaders engaged in self-serving politics, enriching themselves at the expense of the people. Why did the Philippines fall behind while others like Singapore thrived? This is where Lee Kuan Yew's warning comes in. Lee Kuan Yew was blunt. He did not sugarcoat his words. He once said, "The Philippines is a country with a great people, but with a soft, forgiving culture. It doesn't punish people for their mistakes, especially those in power." Think about that for a second. A soft, forgiving culture. What did he mean by that? Lee Kuan Yew believed that a nation's progress depended on discipline, the rule of law, accountability. He admired the resilience and talent of Filipinos, praising their ability to adapt and excel. He saw that Filipinos who migrated abroad often thrived under more structured systems, proving that the problem was never about their capability. It was about the environment they lived in. But he also saw a flaw in the country's governance and culture. Corruption, inefficiency, and a deep-seated tolerance for wrongdoing. He observed how high-ranking officials misused public funds, yet faced little to no consequences. He noticed that politicians accused of graft and plunder not only escaped punishment, but were often welcomed back into office by the very people they had betrayed. The justice system, according to him, moved at a frustratingly slow pace. Cases dragged on for years, sometimes decades, allowing those with power and wealth to manipulate the system in their favor. High-profile corruption scandals would erupt, public outrage, but after a while, the noise would fade and everything would return to normal until the next scandal broke out. Lee Kuan Yew feared that this pattern, where wrongdoers were forgiven instead of being held accountable, would prevent the Philippines from achieving its full potential. In contrast, he built Singapore on a foundation of strict governance and zero tolerance for corruption. He ensured that officials, no matter how high-ranking, faced swift consequences for any misconduct. He believed that a country needed to enforce discipline at all levels, from leadership to ordinary citizens, if it was to prosper. This was the heart of his warning. Without accountability, corruption would fester. Without strict enforcement of law, the country's institutions would weaken. Without discipline, progress would always be hindered by inefficiency and mismanagement. Was he right? Decades have passed since he made the observation, but the same issues continue to plague the Philippines. Political dynasties still dominate the landscape. Corruption cases still takes years to resolve, if they ever get resolved at all. Public trust in institutions remains low as scandals and incompetence continues to erode confidence in the system. The question remains, can the Philippines break free from this cycle? Or will it continue to be a nation of great potential, held back by the very culture that refuses to demand real accountability? Let's rewind back to the 1960s. The Philippines was one of the most promising economies in Asia. It had a booming manufacturing sector, an educated workforce, and was even considered a model for developing nations. In fact, at one point, the Philippines was wealthier than South Korea. The country had strong infrastructure, an expanding middle class, and was a key economic player in the region. It was even lending money to South Korea, which was still struggling to recover from the devastation of the Korean War. But while other countries like Singapore, South Korea doubled down on discipline, economic reforms, and industrialization, the Philippines took a different path, one plagued by political instability, corruption, and misplaced priorities. The seeds of decline had already been planted. By the 1970s, Singapore had transformed itself into an industrial and financial powerhouse. Lee Kuan Yew's government focused on strict governance, meritocracy, and attracting foreign investment. South Korea, under the leadership of Park Chung-hee, also embarked on an aggressive economic development plan. Through export-driven industrialization, land reforms, and a focus on manufacturing, South Korea rapidly closed the economic gap and surpassed the Philippines. Investments in industries like steel, shipbuilding, and electronics allowed South Korea to become a major global exporter. Meanwhile, the Philippines entered a dark period of political turmoil. In 1972, President Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law, consolidating power and suppressing opposition. While his administration initially pursued infrastructure projects, the economy suffered due to excessive borrowing and a growing debt crisis. By the 1980s, the Philippines was spiraling into economic decline. Inflation skyrocketed, unemployment rose, and foreign investors lost confidence. Corruption was rampant, with billions of dollars being siphoned off by the ruling elite. The peso collapsed, and the country's economic potential was squandered. In contrast, by the 20th century, South Korea had become a major global economy with thriving companies like Hyundai and LG. Singapore had transformed into a financial and technological hub, boasting one of the highest GDP per capita figures in the world. Lee Kuan Yew saw all of this coming and repeatedly pointed out that the Philippines had all the resources and talent needed to succeed, but it lacks strong leadership, discipline, and accountability. He observed that without decisive governance, without cracking down on corruption, and without long-term economic planning, the Philippines would continue to struggle. Today, the Philippines faces many of the same challenges that hindered its progress decades ago: corruption, political instability, and weak infrastructure. While its Southeast Asian neighbors have surged ahead, the country remains stuck in a cycle of economic stagnation, proving that leadership and governance can make or break a nation's future. It's been decades since Lee Kuan Yew made those remarks. But look around. Are corrupt politicians still winning elections? Is the justice system still slow and ineffective? Are public funds still being misused? If the answer is yes, then perhaps Lee Kuan Yew's warning was not just a prediction, but a prophecy, one that continues to unfold before our eyes. The good news: warnings don't have to mean doom. They can be wake-up calls. Lee Kuan Yew did not just highlight weaknesses. He showed that change is possible with the right leadership, discipline, and long-term vision. Singapore was not always the global success story it is today. In the 1960s, it was a struggling nation, rife with poverty, ethnic tensions, and political instability. But through decisive governance, strict anti-corruption policies, and relentless focus on education and economic development, Singapore transformed itself into one of the most prosperous and stable nations in the world. So, can the Philippines do the same? The Philippines, like Singapore in its early years, has immense potential. It has a young and dynamic population, a wealth of natural resources, a strategic position in the global economy. But potential alone is not enough. Just as Singapore made hard choices, the Philippines must also take bold steps toward real reform. This means strengthening institutions, ensuring accountability, and demanding more from leaders. It means prioritizing merit over political connections, education over entertainment, and long-term development over short-term gains. Change is never easy, and it won't happen overnight. But if Singapore proved that transformation is possible, then there is no reason the Philippines cannot achieve the same. The question is, will the country heed the warning, allow history to repeat itself? Lee Kuan Yew was not trying to insult the Philippines. He was offering a tough love reality check. His words were not meant to demean, but to challenge the nation to reflect and rise above its struggles. The Philippines has everything it needs to succeed. Singapore's transformation under Lee Kuan Yew was built on discipline, accountability, and a government that prioritized the people's welfare over political self-interest. Meanwhile, the Philippines, despite moments of economic growth, has struggled with systemic issues that keep it from reaching its full potential. Many argue that until strong institutions replace political dynasties and short-term leadership, history will continue to repeat itself. But change is possible. The Filipino people have proven their resilience time and time again. The question now is, will the Philippines prove Lee Kuan Yew wrong? Will it break the cycle of poor governance and missed opportunities? Or will his warning continue to be ignored, allowing the same challenges to persist for generations?